stay tuned because for the next 60 minutes, Motorsports Unlimited is on the air. Hi, I'm Jerry Bryant, and these are the lovely ladies of motorsports. And all this hour, we're going to have 60 minutes of action-packed excitement. All kinds of exciting things will happen. And we got the famous Bill Wildt, and we got all kinds of other good stuff that's happening all this hour. Motorsports Unlimited, 60 minutes of non-stop action. So let's go to the studio right now.
Hi, I'm Gina Lisa.
I'm Kimberly Blackford.
I'm Elizabeth Rizzo, and we would like to welcome you to Motorsports Unlimited Part 185.
Today we're doing our long-awaited show about rear ends.
Rear ends?
That's right, Kimberly, rear ends. And it's a lot more interesting than you might think. Let's join Bill and the rest of the girls and begin our education.
Well, now, you guys have to admit that I bring you to some pretty glamorous places. What do you think, Marche?
This is something else here.
This is the height of glamour. This is the second time for Elizabeth to be with us. Elizabeth, what do you think? Glamour surrounding?
Oh, it's great.
Okay, I thought you'd enjoy this. Now, I should tell you that, and I'm going to check out and see if this young man knows as much about this place as his brother. First of all, introduce yourself to our audience.
Jim Bushman.
Okay, you're Paul Bushman's brother.
Yes.
Okay, what do you call this place?
Oh, it's the recycling yard.
See, he does it too. Paul, you said he wouldn't do it. We've got another Bushman yuppie here in the family. And I better be careful. These guys are both bikers. I really shouldn't do this to them. Anyhow, we are at, I should say, this is, and I never have fully understood this, this is sort of the ABC Circus Junkyard Auto Parts Recycling something?
That's correct. Yeah, we could call it that.
Okay, and what is a Marche? We invited a couple of girls here specifically today to do the show. What's the show going to be about?
Rear ends.
That's correct. Today's show is going to be about rear ends, and obviously we cannot ignore the double entendre, of course. But on the other hand, you guys have been doing these car shows now for the past 2-3 months with us, and we always have you ask what kind of engine, what kind of transmission, what kind of rear end, right? Do you have any idea what that means? I should say you know a little bit now because you've been asking me.
Yes, I know a little bit.
Okay, well, let's see if Elizabeth, do you know what a rear end is?
It's right here.
No. Is from an automotive standpoint, do you know what a rear end is?
The back end, right?
What?
The back end.
Show it to me, point it at me.
Well, I think the side is, right?
Well, no, this is the front.
Oh, that's the front. Okay, then it's on that side.
Okay, walk down there and show me. Walk down there and show me. Okay, show me what the rear end is.
Right here, isn't it?
No, the rear end is right here.
Oh, it's right here. I knew that.
Okay, let me take you and put you back now. First of all, I want to thank these guys. When we talked about doing this program, I called your brother Paul and asked him to see if he could set some things up. I got to say, were you involved with it all? You guys really knocked yourselves out.
Yeah, I had got everything put together that he asked me to get put together.
Okay, well that's great because these guys have made it real possible for us to properly explain rear ends, what they do, what they are, why they're important, and we're even going to go farther than that. We're going to talk to our audience today. We're going to explain stagger. Has anybody ever heard the term stagger used? You ever watch a stock car race and they use the word stagger, Chris?
Yes, I have.
Okay, anyone else ever heard the term stagger? No? Just from you. Just from me?
Yep.
Okay, well you'll see. We're going to explain all those things today, and it all has to do with the rear end, right, Jim?
That's right.
Okay,
Bill,
yes, Chris.
I'd like to say one thing, though. I'd like to tell you that all the girls have been looking forward to this show since we decided that we were going to do this. Everybody's interested in finding out what it is.
Okay, first of all, let me tell you what you're looking at in front of you here is the chassis from an automobile or a truck or a vehicle. It doesn't really make any difference. In fact, Jim, tell us what it is.
It's a 85 S10 Blazer frame.
Okay, in other words, we're talking about a kind of a normal car chassis. We could put any kind of a body on here. Normally the engine, it's not in here right now, but the engine would be sitting right here. This is where the engine goes. Behind it would be the transmission. And I want to qualify this for our purists out there that when we're talking about, I wanted the simplest, most common kind of chassis, which would be a rear drive chassis, and we'll talk about that a little bit more when we go in. A rear drive front engine chassis, which for many years, 100% of the American automobiles were built that way, and still even now, probably 60 or 70% of them are rear drive cars. So you'd have engine, transmission, And then what happens? Now remember, the engine is making power and ends up turning a shaft in this direction. So it's turning like this. Now the wheels would be sitting here. These would be the front wheels, and the back wheels over here, these are the brake drums, would be turning like this. So we come out with power like this. It goes through the transmission. It's still turning like this. Comes back through the drive shaft. How do we get it to turn the wheels like this? Gina, come on down here.
Remember this conversation?
Gina, we talked about this a little bit before. How do you get the power that's turning like this and turning the drive shaft like this to turn a wheel like this?
In the rear end.
Exactly correct. That's what a rear end does. That's what we've got right here. Now, I just wanted to take a look at this chassis so that the people get an idea of the relationship of the components. We're going to go inside because this isn't as simple as it looks, and I want to explain what I'm talking about when we go inside. So if you'd step back over there. Now, is everybody ready? Are we all ready to learn about rear ends? And in fact, Paul's probably going to join us.
Yes, he is.
Okay, and we're going to have fun with this, but I hope at the end of the program everybody understands rear ends, everybody understands stagger, and there's another key word in here. We call this rear end, and, well, let's talk about all that when we go inside, because actually the wind is blowing pretty good out here.
I can tell this could go into part 2, Bill.
Yeah, this could be a part 2 and part 3, because we got a lot of material to cover. So, Marche, what do you want to tell that camera?
We'll be right back.
Rear ends, huh? Now this is going to be interesting. But first, let's meet the girls that did the location work.
Hi, I'm Chris Schutz.
And I'm Marche Harmon.
I'm Elizabeth Rizzo.
I'm Gina Lisa.
Thank you, girls. Now let's return to ABC Auto Parts and find out about rear ends.
We're talking about rear ends. Girls, we showed you where the component was in the automobile. What do you suppose, and Chris, I'll start with you, what do you suppose the rear end actually does? Now, we talked a little bit about it out there.
Transmits the, no, that's the transmission, would transmit the power to the wheels.
Well, the transmission transmits it from the engine to the what?
To the wheels.
Now to the rear end.
Oh, to the rear end, and then from the rear end to the wheels.
Right. In effect, you could kind of call a rear end a transmission because it transmits power.
If we knew all that, Bill, we wouldn't be here.
Okay. But it has to do something else, and I want to show why that it has to do something else. Gina, and let me see, what's the best way to explain this to the audience? If this were simple to do. Now remember, and I want to tell a little bit of a story here first, and hopefully my technical friends in the audience will bear with me a little bit. When I was very young, I was like 4 or 5 years old, I happened to I lived in a farming community in upstate New York. And I was always interested in mechanical things, and they sort of fascinated me. I kept hearing about Jeeps with four-wheel drive, Jeeps with four-wheel drive. Now, I was a very young child, and I don't remember how old, but it was somewhere 4 or 5 years old. I was fascinated with that process, and the farmer, they were doing what they called, they had a rock slide they were dragging behind a Jeep, and that's where they go through the fields and pick up the rocks that work their way through the ground. Apparently, rocks continually come through. So he was back there working, and I was just kind of hanging around, and he kept talking about how nice it was with the four-wheel drive. And every time he got into the Jeep and he drove it forward, I kind of watched real carefully because I didn't want to let him know I didn't know what it meant, but I was kind of watching.
You were doing this at 5.
Yeah, but now here's the idea. I kind of thought when you talk four-wheel drive, I assume we're talking about drive, like steering. Mm-hmm. So I expected to see when the front wheels turned, I expected to see the back wheels turn a little bit because it was four-wheel drive. Now, does that make sense to?
Yeah, that makes sense.
Okay, it kind of makes sense. Well, that's one of the reasons I'm taking the time to tell the story is because four-wheel drive doesn't mean four-wheel steering. It means the power goes to all four wheels. Only the front wheels steer on the Jeep. So kind of when I'd watch it, he'd say, you see how that four-wheel drive worked? I'd go, yeah, but I really didn't see it. See, and I really didn't want to say that I didn't see it. And many people are like that. They don't really realize what we're talking about, that when you make an automobile go forward, you have to do it somehow. Now, we don't have a propeller on it like with an airplane where it would kind of go forward by thrust. We don't do it that way. So making the power in the engine still doesn't make the car go forward. Something has to make the car go forward. What we're talking about today are rear drive, two-wheel drive, rear drive cars, front engine, rear drive cars. And we're talking because it's like a basic commodity. If you understand that one, the rest of the things will make more sense. But when we're talking about rear drive, what we mean is the power from the engine goes to the two rear wheels, and that's what makes the car go forward. The power from the engine turns the rear wheels. Now, is that understandable to everybody?
Yes.
Because I already told you before, right?
Yes, you did.
Okay, but does that make sense? So the audience should know, and again, our show is for the general public, that what we're talking about when we say two-wheel drive or rear-wheel drive, we mean that the power from the engine is going to the rear wheels and only to the rear wheels. Doesn't turn the front wheels at all. Now, what do you think if we were to take that power and we were to drive the two rear wheels? There's something in a rear end called a differential. Do you have any idea what a differential is?
No.
Marche? No, I haven't, because I talked to you on the way out here. We're not going to let her answer.
I thought that the differential and the rear end were the same thing.
Well, the differential is part of the rear end, and I want to explain why a rear end...
Component of the rear end?
Yeah, it's a part of it. I want to explain why we need it. And the first thing I'm going to do, and we just had you guys demonstrate this so we could see if we could do this. Gina, you and Elizabeth, I'd like you guys to come over and let's step over this way. And what I want to demonstrate is what happens if you just drive both rear wheels. If the engine only drove the rear wheels. What we've got here is we've got a set of rear wheels, and again, I want to thank Paul Bushman and Jim Bushman for going through all this work to make these components for us. Now, what we have essentially done here is made like these are the rear wheels of the car, and we're going to drive the rear wheels. Now, you guys, in a sense, are going to sort of pretend you're the motors. You're going to turn it on the axle.
And we can only go straight.
Pardon me?
We can only go straight
Why is that?
because is that anything to do with the differential?
Sure is. Now, what I want to show you is I want you guys to go ahead and just push this about 5 or 6 feet. Okay? Now, I'm going to stop it. Okay, you guys can stop it. That's fine. Now, as you can see, as you turn the axle, the vehicle would go forward. If we had a car attached to this, it would go forward, right? All right, now back up, and I'm going to push it back to you. Go ahead. Now, it gets a little bit more complicated, and that's why a rear end it's harder than it looks. Now, what I want you guys to do is push it again, except this time I want you to pretend that we're making a right-hand turn, that we're going to try this car that's...
Then she would have to go out and I not do anything, just stand there like pretty much hold it in place.
Well, that's exactly right. Now, I want you guys to go ahead and do that. Okay? You're going to be like you're making that turn over there. Now, come on, you got to make a turn. Turn. You have to... No, make it turn. No, make it turn. Okay, let's push it back and start over. What's that now, Gina?
Can't do it, Bill.
You can't do it. Now, Chris and wait a minute.
Hold it there. You have to hold it there and then like scoot it.
Well, that's okay. Christine, come on over here. Marche, come on over here. Now, you guys were watching with some laughter over there. I want you two guys to take this thing, and I want you to make a turn. I want you to, again, you're going to make a right-hand turn with this thing. Well, you got the idea. You're getting over here to the right, and you're putting to the left wheel. Okay, now make the turn. What does she got to do?
She has to hold that side.
Okay, now go ahead.
This is not going to happen.
Okay.
Wait a minute. What is that now? Come on.
Wheels aren't turning. How can you make it go that way? Because it won't go that way, Bill.
Okay, if you guys would step back over there by the rear ends, and now we're going to find out what a rear end does. What I'm trying to demonstrate is the reason we have a differential. By now, it should be clear to you guys, that in order for this thing to go around a corner, now we're going to drive both of those rear ends, both those rear wheels, but some way we have to be able to put power to both wheels, right? Both of them have to be able to apply power, but they have to be able to turn at different speeds. And it has to be able to change all the time. In other words, there we were trying to make a right-hand corner. The next corner might be a left-hand corner. So we have to be able to, and which wheel is going to, wait a minute.
In other words, we've been tricked. It's not possible to do it with
No, the thing I want you to understand, if you guys, in fact, you're in a good line just the way you are. And I want to pretend that we're going to make a turn here. And Marche, you're the outside wheel. And what I'd like you guys to do is just like on a skating line. I want you guys to walk, and I want you to see how much further Marche has to go than Chris does. You're going around me. I'm the corner. So just go ahead and walk around me, guys. Now, stay in a line, though, just like a chorus line. Right here. Go this way. Keep coming right around this way. Keep in a line. Keep coming. All right. Now, do you see how far Marche had to walk?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, you guys can come back over here now. And if you were turning the opposite way, the person on the outside would have to walk the furthest distance. But the trick of this thing is somehow we've got to drive both rear wheels. You can't just drive one rear wheel. We've got to get at least both. We've got to get both rear wheels driving. So we need a device in there that can accomplish that. Now, if you guys would, if you walk over there to the tool bench, we've got a couple things set up there. As a matter of, well, yeah, go ahead. And just step right down this way. Right down over here. Just keep coming. All right, what we have here, and I have a feeling that we're going to have to reset this up a little bit. That's okay, girls. Step right in here. I have a feeling we're going to have to reset up our camera shot a little bit so we can explain this. Who said it? What do you want to tell our cameraman there? Or actually, what do you want to tell our audience?
Don't go away, we'll be right back. We certainly learned very quickly that when both wheels are on a common axle, it's nearly impossible to go around a corner. Apparently, an important component in a rear end is the differential, and it, in some way, allows the wheels to turn at different speeds, while still being part of the same axle assembly. Something tells me this isn't going to be simple. Let's look at a differential.
These are actually fascinating devices. Certainly, in my opinion, they're fascinating devices. And Chuck, I'm going to ask you to come back in on that nice tight shot of the differential. What we're looking at here is the thing that makes it possible to put power to both rear wheels and yet have them both turn at a different number of revolutions per minute, which is exactly, as you guys can see, what's necessary in order for the car to turn. Otherwise, it can't turn. And if you look inside here, what we have, and I'm hoping Chuck's on a tight shot of this or is about to get one, what we have here is a group of gears called a spider gear. These are called the spider gears. Oh, wait a minute. Jana, you've heard of that before? Hold on, let me step over by you.
You've mentioned it.
You've mentioned it
Right.
when I was asking questions one day after our other shoot.
Okay, these are called the spider gears, and essentially what happens, and I'm going to walk over here and bring in a ring and pinion, and I think our audience, can kind of follow what this looks like. If we were going to turn that rear axle, in fact, and I'm sure I'm making Chuck absolutely crazy on the camera. I'm sorry about the focus problem. If we were going to try to drive this axle with these wheels, and Elizabeth, can you come over here and hold the mic for me, please? You got to hold it near my mouth, okay? If we were going to try to, instead of having the girls turning the axle, if we were going to have mechanical components like an engine and that turn the axle, we would have a ring gear like this, and this would be a pinion. Now this comes from the drive shaft, from the transmission, and from the engine, and it meshes with the ring gear like this, and so as we turn this, that's what turns the axle. That's what makes the axle turn. But obviously, if we did it just this way, just had the ring on here, and there are race cars like that, and we're going to get into all that. If we just did it this way, obviously, it would be very tough to get the car to go around a corner. And as a matter of fact, there's a name for that. We often used to call these locked rear ends. But now, let me get back over to the differential. Follow me with that mic.
Bill?
You hold on, Christine, let me get the mic to you.
All right, then, if someone refers to the differential as a gear, that's what they're talking about then.
Right, that's language in the motorsport community. When somebody says, what kind of a gear do you have? If you count the number of teeth on this pinion and the number of teeth on the ring gear and divide the one into the other, that'll tell you what kind of a gear you have when people now this one happens to be a 331. And all that means is if you count the number of teeth on here and the number of teeth on there and you divide the one into the other, it comes out 3.31, meaning this will turn 3.31 times to every one turn of that.
My guess is, because this belongs to John Plathania, that this is the gear that you want.
Oh, no, it depends on what you want it for. For example, if you were going in drag racing application and you had a very high RPM engine, say a small block Chevy, you would probably want something up around a 514, meaning this turns a lot more times to every turn of that because you're going to rev the engine up real hard. But if you were going to go, you don't want to use like a 514 gear or a 488, you don't want to use anything like that on the highway because the engine will be revving so high all the time that you won't be able to get decent gas mileage or keep the engine together. So it depends on the application. Most of the time, hot street cars are going to run something in the vicinity of anywhere from a 456 to a 514.
Okay, quite a difference. Also, before we go any further, now, I don't understand why we could not make that turn. I mean, I don't understand what drives the front wheels of the car.
Ah, good point. And that's what I was talking about, why I want the public to understand these things. Nothing drives the front. On a rear drive car, the only wheels that make the car move are the ones in the back, the two rear wheels. That's called a rear drive car.
So, in other words, these are just being shoved along? They don't...
You mean the front ones?
Yeah, the front wheels.
Exactly right. They're just kind of along for the ride. Now, obviously, you steer the car with them, but it doesn't make the car go forward.
Oh, okay.
In other words, there's no power going to those wheels. The only power going to the rear is on a rear drive car. The only power is going to the rear wheels. Now, one peculiarity, yes.
I got a question. Like on a Citation that's front-wheel drive, was the rear end in the front?
That's exactly correct. Now, I don't want to go into all that. We're going to do front-wheel drive shows. As a matter of fact, we're going to make Paul Bushman and Jim Bushman crazy again because this is a ton of work for them arranging all these components for us. But we are going to do a show about front-wheel drive and show. But you're right. You need the same components. They just end up arranged differently. But in a rear drive car, the only thing that's driving is the rear wheels. Now, there's one peculiarity of these things, and let me just show you how if I can at all. And again, Elizabeth, maybe you can hold this mic for me, and we can try to do it without blocking the camera shot. What happens here, and again, maybe Chuck, we can get a tight shot on this. What happens is that we don't really drive the rear axle with the ring gear the way I just demonstrated over by that component there. What we actually drive is this carrier. The ring gear is bolted to this carrier, and it turns this carrier. And when it turns this carrier, it could turn the rear wheels. An axle goes into this end, and an axle goes into this end. So as this thing turns, this whole carrier turns, it's going to want to turn the axles coming out of each end of them, right? However, because the axles aren't connected together, they're connected into this gear, part of the spider gear arrangement. In this gear, these can turn independently of each other, and I hope I can, without getting totally filthy, and I don't think I can, but if maybe the camera shot can see it that way, can see that I'm turning the one way and the other one is turning the other way. Okay, does that make any sense at all? Now, this gives the axles the ability to turn independently of each other and at different speeds, because these gears will change relationship to each other as this entire unit is turning. Now, I'm seeing blank expressions. I don't know if I'm making... Okay. Let me see if I can get a rag, first of all. Our crew is sending us a rag. Who doesn't get it?
I don't understand it. Neither does Marche, right, Marche?
No.
Marche, you don't get it either? Okay.
I'm still not getting it.
Bill, for those spider gears, okay? So like when you go around the turn, because one tire has to go more times than the other tire.
Right.
Okay, so that's for the spider gears come in.
That's correct.
Okay, so when you go around the turn, one axle has to go more times than the other times.
That's correct.
The purpose for...
So then there's an axle for the right wheel and for the left.
Exactly. Okay,
Oh,
perhaps
okay.
I didn't explain that. Now let me get one here. Now what we've made up here, and what these guys, again, I want to thank them, what they've made up for us is they made, and I asked them to do this because we're going to demonstrate something else later, they made it one axle across between the two wheels. But the reality is, this is a car axle. This one happens to be for a Camaro. And this is what would go to one wheel. And there'd be another one going to the other wheel. And these splined ends...
That would go into this part where the spider...
Exactly correct.
Okay.
That would go in here, and it would actually go into the spider gear. Okay?
Yeah.
Now, does that make a little bit more sense? And that allows these things to turn in a different relationship to each other, because what happens is, let's say this one is in here turning on this particular gear, and that one there has to turn a little faster. Well, it just revolves around and changes relationship, the gears with each other, because of the spider gears in between. So actually, it's a complicated device that works marvelously well, because when you think about it, how could you drive two wheels at different speeds without having something slipping? And there's nothing slipping in here. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, we've got one more thing to explain about these things. It's a
When you hear
peculiarity.
about the rear end slipping, though, is that what's happening?
When you hear what?
Isn't that a term that can't happen? What if that does happen?
So, give me the term again.
Can the rear end slip, like you said, if it didn't slip?
No, it doesn't slip. The rear end doesn't slip. Now, let me just explain something.
I mean, even if the bearings or whatever got worn out,
No.
it still wouldn't?
Nope.
Oh.
Okay, unless you're talking about a Posi unit, and I don't want to get into, we're going to get that. In fact, we're going to get to that. We're going to get to that right now. Now, what?
Both wheels turn at the same time. Isn't that Posi?
Well, but it's a trick you play. Let me just explain. One of the peculiarities of a differential is it's sort of the downside of it. Every engineer will tell you there's nothing that's all good and nothing that's all bad. Everything is compromised. Everything you give up something to get something. Okay, fair enough? Now, what you give up here, it gives you that ability to take and turn that thing around the corner either way, sending power to both rear wheels. It does that just fine. Unfortunately, though, what happens is it sends the power to the wheel that least needs it. For example, if you're stuck at a curb and you're spinning the rear wheels, both of the rear wheels don't spin. Only one spins. Does that make sense? Let me get over here. Elizabeth, does that make sense to you? Have you ever been stuck in a rear drive car and only one wheel is spinning?
No.
Okay, anybody had that experience? Anybody?
I've heard of it, and like an ice or something.
Like in a snow, exactly, like in snow and ice, and one wheel is, you're stuck because the wheel is spinning? Well, that's a peculiarity of the differential. This ability that gives the axles to turn at different speeds has a downside, and the downside is that if you have no traction on one of your rear wheels, all the power goes to that wheel and it sits there and spins. So that is a downside to it. If you have traction in both wheels, power goes to both wheels. But the power will go to the wheel with the least traction.
That's when you need four-wheel drive.
What's this?
That's when you need four-wheel drive.
Well, you might be able to get away with two-wheel drive if both of the wheels were turning. But because of the differential, only one of the wheels is going to turn. Does that make sense? Am I getting there? Oh, wait a minute.
You said if both wheels have these differentials. I thought all cars have at least two differentials.
Oh, no, they don't. Not at all. As a matter of fact, I'll tell you what. Let's rearrange some components here. Elizabeth, I want you to look over here at the camera and give our audience some instructions.
Don't go away. We'll be right back. I think I understand that the spider gears in the rear end somehow allow the rear axles to turn at different speeds while still being powered by the same single source. We also learned that an unfortunate characteristic of a differential is that power is sent to the wheel with the least traction. In this next segment, we're going to find out about Positraction rear ends, also known as limited slip differentials.
Marsha, your question is excellent, and I want to make sure that we respond to it. As a matter of fact, that's what we try to do with this program, is we do want folks to understand cars. Now, repeat it.
Okay, I would like to find out if all cars have two differentials.
All right, why would you think they would have two differentials now that you have a little understanding of what they're for?
Because of the turning of each wheel that each wheel has to do on a car. Like when you turn the corners, you have to go the right or the left. So I figured that each wheel would have to have a differential. If it's a rear end driver.
Okay, let me ask you this. No, wait a minute. I want you to think about it. Now, where would you have? Now, you know that we've got this differential, one of these differentials we have between the rear wheels. So, in effect, think of it, it distributes power to each one of the rear wheels. Now, where would the other differential be?
In the front.
Okay, that's the point I'm trying to make. The front wheels are not driven on these kind of cars. Those wheels don't get driven. There's no power going to them, so they don't need a differential. No, there's only one, on a front engine rear drive car, there's only one differential, and that distributes the power to each one of the rear wheels. The front wheels do not make the car go. You just steer with those. They're literally like trailer wheels. They don't have any effect on moving the vehicle. Does that make sense?
Can I have another question?
You bet.
Are you saying that these things are inside these?
That's exactly right. We're just getting that. Go ahead.
Because I thought they were next to the wheel.
You did too?
Yeah, I thought there was one on each end.
Okay, this really, I've said this before when I've explained to folks about, why we've used the Girls on a program and everything. This is exactly why we use them, because things that we take for granted, that everybody knows, we can't explain it to folks if we don't have these kind of questions. Exactly. Now, that would never occur to me that that's what you were thinking, so I'm glad that you asked. Yes, the differential goes in here. That's what these housings are. In fact, this whole housing is called a banjo unit. The whole housing. The differential that goes inside of there obviously is called a differential. It's also called other things. We call it a gear. That's sort of slanguage. We'll say that it's a gear. And this whole thing can often be referred to as a rear end. And also we very often refer to just the differential portion of it. We call it a rear end. But yes, that's what goes inside of there. Okay, does that make sense now? Make it a little, okay? Now, what we've got here, we've stood this one up, we've got what's called a Positraction rear end. Now, you remember that peculiarity I was talking about because of the way this distributes power, that the wheel that doesn't have the traction, for example, if you're stuck in the snow and one wheel is like, that's the one that's going to spin and the other one does nothing? Well, this sort of corrects that problem, but I want to say it with this disclaimer ahead of time. Any engineer can tell you, you don't get something for nothing. Everything is compromised. This has downside on it too, and I'm going to explain that. Jim, if you'd come on in, I understand Jim can explain a little bit about the workings of a Positraction unit. Jim, have you been paying attention at all? Please step right on over here. Have you been paying attention at all to what we've been talking about?
Sure.
Okay, so take it from here now as far as what does the Positraction unit do? And I should say Positraction is a Chevrolet, sort of a Madison Avenue word, and it has to do with a, how would we call it? A device that will distribute power to both rear wheels.
Right.
Ford, I think, called it Equalock. Could I be wrong?
They just had a lock. They called it a lock type rear end, nothing.
Right. There was, in other words, I don't want to give people the word Positraction is actually a Chevrolet brand thing, but all the manufacturers make one.
Right.
Now, is that
Wait a minute, Chris.
a type of a rear end then, a Positraction?
Yeah, Positraction is Chevrolet's option for what we're going to explain. Now, Jim, step on over here. Now, tell me what it does. What? I'm taking it one step higher.
Okay, it's not just Chevy, it's all GM has a Positraction.
Okay, well, good point. You're right. I have a friend of mine had a Cadillac, believe it or not, that he ordered a Positraction on.
Okay, the way this works is instead of the gears turning opposite ways, there's friction plates in there on either side of the gears. And they both turn normally if you're just driving. When you go to turn a corner, then the friction plates, it's like a spring. It's spring loaded. So
Okay, let me keep talking. As a matter of fact, I'm going to take and turn this up for our camera. And Chuck, you're going to have to tell me if I'm giving you a shot that you can see it all. We're trying to see these plates up here and the spring in between. Can we see that? Okay, we're getting a thumbs up. Now, if you'd bend down a little bit so I can give you the mic, and go ahead and explain the working.
Okay, as in this one turns opposite ways, but if you tried to turn these won't turn freely because it's as a spring with these plates are spring loaded also so that they press against the gears so they turn both at the same time. Now if you wanted to turn a corner, that's what the springs are for. It releases some of the tension on here so that you can turn without having the problem they had with the straight axle wheel.
Okay, let me give a little bit of an explanation on it. What they're trying to do here is to have this arranged in such a way that you don't end up with one wheel spinning in the snow, so that it'll send power to the wheel that doesn't have traction. It helps people in conditions where they have to get out of snowbanks and things like that. However, and you have to remember this, that there's a downside to this, and that downside is that if you're going on a road, say about 30, 40 miles an hour, say on an expressway off-ramp with a light rain, and you start applying power, both wheels are going to spin. And if both wheel spins, you're going to loop the car. You lose directional control. So it's one of the reasons all cars don't have Positractions. All cars shouldn't have them because it takes an experienced driver to understand the downside of it. That what will happen normally on an expressway ramp, say with a light rain and you apply some power, is maybe the inside tire, because the weight of the car has been transferred to the outside, the inside tire will start to spin. The outside tire still provides directional stability. It's still turning in relationship to the ground. But as soon as both of them spin, there's no way for the back end to track straight and the car will spin out. So that's the downside of a Positraction rear end. Yes, it is helpful when you get yourself into an area where you need traction. And essentially the way it works is when the power is applied from the front, meaning when it's coming from the drive shaft going through the pinion gear to the ring gear, when it's coming there, when you apply power, it locks up the differential and sends power to both wheels. However, when the wheels are trying to turn at a different speed, in effect, as far as the differential is concerned, the power is being applied from going this way, because it's almost like you took your hands here and tried to turn this axle faster than this axle, and under those conditions it will allow the clutches to slip slightly so the wheels can turn at different speeds. In other words, it's still a differential, but it has this trick component in here that allows, when you put power to it, that turns both rear wheels, with the downside, and I really want our audience to understand that, with the downside that you can get yourself in trouble with a Positraction rear end. I'm sorry, Christine, let me get back over there.
It doesn't sound like something that you would want on your car.
Well, it is something for an experienced driver, if he's knowledgeable about what he's doing and understands the components and what they can do and what they can't do, it's not really a problem. In fact, it can be a great help. In fact, most guys that would do drag racing back in the earlier days would always use Positractions because otherwise they'd end up with one wheel spinning. Now, that's not as popular as it used to be because the cars are developing so much power now. These are more fragile than those, and you can break these components. There are also some other ways to do this, and I don't want to get too deep into this because we don't have one here. There's a company called, I'm sorry, Gina? Step right out on her.
Like for a vehicle that has a really light end, like El Camino or an S10, you know, that has an open bed back, would it be better just to have a regular rear end or a Posi rear end?
Again, what you get with the Posi rear end is better traction in slippery conditions, but what you give up, I guess the best way to explain this, and I've tried to come up with ways to explain this, a tire or a wheel does not give a vehicle any directional stability unless it's turning in correct relationship to the ground. The best thing I can tell you to think about is if you're coming up very slowly on a very icy street and you're coming up to an intersection, you're going to come to a complete stop, and you lock your front wheels. As soon as you lock the front wheels with the brake, that front end will just slide towards wherever the lowest side is. It'll go towards the curb or something because you lose directional stability. And if you release the brake a little bit and let it turn again, you can steer the car. You can't steer it while it's locked. The same thing if a wheel is spinning. In other words, it's not turning in relationship to the ground. It loses directional stability. For example, if you had a locked rear end, and a locked rear end, I should explain, if you took this differential, and Chuck, maybe you can come back in on this tight shot of this one again and give me a signal if we can get this. Okay, he's got a thumbs up. What we used to do, in fact, what I did on my first stock car, is you go in here with a stick welder and just weld these gears together, these spider gears together. I'm sure you're familiar with that, Jim?
Yes.
Yeah, we did that for our stock car, and then what you end up with, essentially, is what you've got here, what we talked about here. Now, I can see we're getting a high side from our cameraman. We're at the end of our tape. We're going to have to change tapes. Real quick, who said it last? Marche, what do we want to tell that camera?
We'll be right back.
What Bill was about to say was that with a locked rear end, if you accelerate fast enough to spin the wheels, the car will fishtail wildly due to lack of directional stability at the rear of the vehicle.
With an open gear or non-Posi-Traction normal differential, only one wheel will spin, allowing the other wheel to provide directional stability.
It seems like you have a choice of good traction or good directional stability.
Now the question is, which one is better?
When we ran out of tape there, we had an excellent question. Gina, will you restate it?
I was just wondering which would be better, like for a light-bedded vehicle like a El Camino or S10 pickup or something like that.
Okay, we've got just
Posi or regular.
we've got just the guy here. Paul, come on over here for a second. We're going to get you in on the act. This guy, while we were off camera, made the best comment. First of all, let me reintroduce you to our audience. This is Paul Bushman, and you're Jim's brother.
That's correct.
You guys really went through a lot of work here. I can't tell you how much we appreciate it. We haven't even shown our audience the other pieces you put together yet for us. Now, can you answer her question? What's better for her light back end, and for that matter, pickup trucks or anything else?
Well, I have an El Camino, and I know for a fact that you're better off with an open, or the first one that we were looking at is called an open differential. Because if you had a Positraction rear end and with no weight in the back there, it'd be all over the road in the rain as well as the snow.
Right, and that's the point that I'm trying to make, and I want our audience to understand that. You don't get something for nothing. When you get this additional traction, the reason that the companies don't automatically put Positractions in every vehicle that they make is because you better have a knowledgeable driver driving the thing and know that he's got to feather this throttle. As soon as he spins both rear wheels, he's going to lose directional stability.
Right.
Okay.
Usually to the right. The back of the truck will usually, your car will go to the right.
Okay, and once again, the important thing to understand is if the wheels aren't turning in direct relationship to the ground, in other words, the rubber should be laying on the ground, and as you go down the road, if it's not doing that, if it's either spinning by putting too much power into it, or if you lock it up with the brakes, at that point it cannot give any directional stability. The thing is going to be all over the place. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes perfect sense.
Okay, now, often people, when we talk about this kind of stuff, they ask, what's the ideal thing? What's the ideal thing? The ideal thing, to my knowledge, has only been produced on one car that I'm aware of, and that's called a Porsche 959 Porsche. It was like $250,000 a piece. They only made 200 of these things. It was an incredible vehicle, and what they had was all-wheel drive. And Marche, that answers your question about don't cars have a front differential? Well, in the case of an all-wheel drive car like the Porsche 959 or the Audi Quattro for that matter, they have 3 differentials. They have the differential in the back, 3, yeah, they have the differential in the back that distributes power to the 2 rear wheels. They also have a differential in the middle to distribute power either to the back of the car or to the front of the car, and a differential in the front to distribute the power to each wheel in the front. But in addition to that, they had what was called a viscous coupling, which enabled these things to turn in different speeds to each other. But most important, you could control it with a computer. And a 959 Porsche had a computer that, measured every eighth of a crankcase revolution. It sensed which wheels had traction and applied power to any of the wheel that had traction. Are you familiar with that?
Yes, I read all about it.
Yeah, you're never impressed with the foreign stuff, right?
Oh, no, that was a very trick piece.
Yeah, and would you agree that probably in the future, that's probably the best way for you to do it? Then you don't have to depend on the operator having great skill and all that?
I believe the Cadillac already has a vehicle like that. I think the Elante is going to have what they call traction control as well as anti-lock brakes next year.
On all 4 wheels?
No, it's front-wheel drive, I believe the car.
Yeah, I think it's just front-wheel drive, whereas the 959, of course, was an all-wheel drive vehicle. Yes, Chris?
Doesn't that add an awful lot of weight, though, to the car?
Again, that's the downside. Engineers can tell you, you don't get something for nothing. It also adds mechanical complexity, more things to go wrong, more things to break, and all the rest of it. There are no...
Would these things be made out of, some sort of composite material, perhaps, to make them lighter, or no?
Obviously, the 959 Porsche was an incredible engineering piece from one end to the other, and yes, everything was composed of carbon fiber, and it had titanium connecting rods and all the rest of it, but they were $250,000 a piece, and you had to wait for 2 years to get one. So it was not something that the general public could go out and buy. But it did prove the point of just how, think of this. This is a car that had about 500 horsepower. It only weighed about 2,200 pounds, and literally a driver, under any circumstances, whether he was on snow or ice or pure ground, could tromp on the throttle.
He had total control at all time then?
Well, actually, the car controlled it completely. As soon as he jumped on it, it made sure it sent power to the wheels that had traction and took power away from the ones that didn't have traction. It was really phenomenal. Wow.
Right.
Yeah. Okay, now I want to talk a little bit more, and Paul, by the way, he set up a real nice thing for us to demonstrate what stagger was and all that sort of thing, but I want to do something else first, and if I can ask everybody to swing all the way down to the other end here so that we want to do a couple of things here. Girls, if you could go down that way. Okay, now you guys all know then what we're talking about here, that here we had an open gear. Now remember what open gear means? Anybody sing out. Open gear.
No.
No, that's okay, because Paul just mentioned it, and have you guys remember when we're doing the car shows, the guy will say, when you ask him what kind of a rear end he's got, he'll say, I've got a 456 open gear. Do you remember?
I've heard that, yes.
Okay, and I don't have
Such a thing as a closed gear.
Yeah, well, what we're referring to as an open gear means a non-Positraction unit. This would be an open gear, okay, the non-Positraction unit. So if he said he had a 456 Posi, this might be what he has. If he said he had a 456 open, this would mean it doesn't have that Positraction device in there. That's what an open gear means when you guys are asking those questions. In addition, you've heard many times during these car shows, you've heard many times people talking about 10-bolt and 12-bolt, right? Everybody,
Many times.
I'm sorry, you don't have a mic.
Many times.
Okay, this is what we're talking about. These 2 differentials, or rear ends, whatever you want to call them, doesn't really make any difference. This one, if you count the bolts on the back, and I don't know, Chuck, can you give me a shot of this one down here? If you counted the bolts on the back that hold this back end cover, as you go around, there are 10 bolts. This one, as you go around, if you count them, there are 12 bolts. Now, it doesn't really make any difference whatsoever how many bolts hold this little tin pan on the back of these things. That really doesn't make any difference. But it identifies the stronger rear end unit. For example, if the car that you're working on originally came with, say, a 6-cylinder motor and it had a 10-bolt rear end on it, and you put a big block 500-horse Chevy in front of the thing, there's no way in the world that the components that are within this rear end are going to hold up. You're going to break axles, or you're going to break rear ends. It's not going to hold up. This one, the 12-bolt, had much stronger components throughout. Another thing, and this, I hope I'm not giving a bad piece of information, but as I stated it, and this seems to be common knowledge, this one happens to be from a 12-bolt rear end. And if you'll notice, it's not just that this thing has 12 bolts on it. The bolts to hold the ring gear onto the carrier, it also has 12, whereas the 10 reportedly has 10 holding it on. This is also a slightly larger diameter. Now, one of the These are very popular rear ends because these are General Motors rear ends, and obviously the most cars are General Motors and all that. So these are real popular, especially this 12-bolt. However, there is a disadvantage to these kind of rear ends, and that disadvantage is in order to put a new ring and pinion in, if you wanted to change ratios, it has to be set up, what they call set up, meaning all of these components, they have shims and spacers and all that sort of thing in there to make the gears work, mesh properly in relationship to each other. Christine?
Do you ever change one or the other, or is it always both?
It depends if they're compatible or not. And remember, the teeth have to mesh. And they might have 3 or 4 rings that will mesh with one pinion and 3 or 4 rings that will mesh with another pinion. So it depends on how much of a change you're going to make. But the point is the rear end has to be reset up. On this kind of a unit, it has to be done in the rear end. It makes it a much more time-consuming job to change ratios. If, for example, you wanted to go for, if this were a 331 ratio and you wanted to go to a 456 ratio for drag racing uses, more acceleration and all that, it's a fairly big job to change it in here. Paul, do you think, can you bring that, what we used to call a pumpkin, I think you called it a pig? Okay.
No wonder we don't know what you guys are talking about.
Yeah, let's set it right down there. And by the way, these things are really heavy. Okay, now on this kind of a rear end, and girls, if you just come down this way a little bit now, this is the very famous 9-inch Ford. And the 9-inch, by the way, refers to, this is not a 9-inch Ford, but it looks the same, so we're not going to try to trick our audience. Was this an old Packard?
It's an old Packard rear carrier.
Okay, but it's the same as far as general appearance. You wouldn't be able to know the difference of what we've got here. Now, if you'll notice, on this unit, the ring and the pinion are set up in this separate housing. This has just got a pan in the back that unbolts and you put all the pieces in through there. This one, the entire unit, the pumpkin, actually pulls out of the rear end. Now Chuck, can we get a camera shot here? Is this going to be doable at all? Down in here? Right in here? Maybe you guys can give me a thumbs up. Okay. On this entire unit comes out. One of the advantages of this is you can have 4 or 5 of those set up with different ratio ring and pinions in them. You can have them set up, and that's of course what the stock cars do, the NASCAR stock car guys. They'll have maybe a dozen different ratios available to them. It's not exactly a quick change because in order to change this, you have to pull the axles out, you have to take the wheels off, pull the axles out and all that. So it's still not exactly what you could call a quick change operation.
Right. A quick change, I don't know if you want to get involved with that, but what that has is a separate cover on the back to change the ratio, and you take the cover off, slide 2 gears off, slide the other 2 on, and put the cover back on. Right.
It's for another show, but you're right. That's something done for racing purposes, but some organizations like NASCAR doesn't allow them.
Right. The rules state in NASCAR you have to run a 9-inch Ford run.
Right, and let me say that to our audience. For as many years this, and I don't remember, I believe it was made for about 25 years. In fact, maybe Ford still makes them?
Yeah, they still come in pickup trucks.
Okay, so they're still made. I know they started in about 1957?
You would know better than I, Bill.
Yeah, I'm almost sure 57 started this rear end, and this was a highly successful rear end. It's called a 9-inch Ford. The 9-inch refers to the diameter of the ring gear. It's 9 inches across, the diameter of the ring gear.
Which is this?
I'm sorry?
Which is this?
That's correct. That's the ring gear. This was called a 9-inch Ford. It had a 9-inch diameter ring gear. It was extremely strong and almost bulletproof rear end. There was ratios available, everything from like 2.50 to 6 something, so there was a tremendous amount of ratios available. The axles were very strong, and every stock NASCAR stock car that you see, whether it's a Pontiac, Olds, Chevy, doesn't make any difference, uses a 9-inch Ford rear end. That's what they use. Gina, I could see you had a question before?
Yes. Chris asked if you can have a rear end slip. Well, how do you blow a rear end? Like,
real easy. These things, like anything, in fact, you know what I thought about it? I was going to ask you guys to round up a big truck differential, like for a big semi or something like that. They've got rear ends that are literally 2 or 3 feet in diameter, correct?
Yes.
All right, and it has to do with how much strain and how much force they have to take. If you take a rear end, say like this, that maybe can handle up to 600-700 horsepower, and run 3,000 horsepower into it, I'll guarantee you can break that ring gear, you can blow the housing apart. It has to do with how much strain it will handle. Does that answer your question?
yeah, how do you know, like, for how much power the engine is or how much power you're putting into it? How do you know what?
Okay, now we're getting the questions that I want. Now we're getting to the questions I want. Let me walk around here. This is great. When you guys are asking those questions of those guys with their cars that they've spent years and years building, and you're asking them what kind of an engine do you have, what kind of a transmission do you have, what kind of a rear end do you have, the question that you're asking is, what did you decide on? What would be strong enough for what you put up front? What would work? What would do the job well enough? And considerable experience and knowledge goes into that. You have to know, for example, that the 9-inch Ford rear end NASCAR stock cars make about 650 horsepower, and it's able to handle that. So if you're building an engine, and from your knowledge and experience, you say you're going to make 500, 550 horsepower, you know a 9-inch Ford will handle it through the experience of what others have done that have gone before you.
Okay.
What choice would you have if you were going to do a funny car?
Bigger problem still. We're talking about maybe,
more horsepower.
right, we're talking about maybe 3,000 or 4,000 horsepower. Now, let me tell you something that happens here. These rear ends that we're looking at, remember we were talking about tubbing the other day, and I'll get to you, don't remind me on that, okay? When you're going to tub a car, the idea is that if you put big wide tires on this thing, this rear end kind of dictates how far apart those wheels will be, right? Okay. Now, if you want, go ahead.
Is this coming up to when you were telling me about one big tire and one small tire?
No, we'll get to that.
Oh, okay.
What we're talking about here is if you wanted to take and put this inside of a car body, you'd have to do what they call narrowing the rear end. Narrowing the rear end might be, and Chuck, if you can get a shot here, you might cut this off here and cut this off here, remachine the ends to do everything that's done out here, weld these pieces back on here like this, take the axles, machine, you see how the axle has, and let me walk over there, and again, I know I'm making Chuck crazy here, and you should know his work is terrific for follow focusing all this stuff. It's very, very difficult. If you notice on the axle, we've got a spline on the end here. So if you were going to go ahead and shorten these axles by narrowing the rear end, and you were going to shorten them, maybe you would cut them down to here, then the axle has to be resplined. Now, as a matter of fact, what really happens, have you ever heard of a company, we've mentioned on the show before, have you ever heard of a company called Strange Engineering?
Yes.
Okay, now what he does is he really narrows these things. He'll narrow them up to here for dragster use, because remember, they're going to have tires that are 17, 18 inches wide here, and in order to get them inside of a funny car body, you're going to end up with no rear end at all. And instead of shortening an axle and resplining it, he builds them from scratch, from aircraft steels.
Right, but you're talking about the axle. I'm talking about the actual rear end itself. I mean, would they use a 9-inch Ford, or would it?
Now you're going to ask me a question that I'm not going to know the answer to, because at one time they would. Paul, do you know what they're using in the funny cars and dragsters? Wait a minute, we don't have a mic down there. Go ahead.
I really couldn't give you an answer. If I had to guess, I'd say Dana rear ends.
Right, and the Dana rear end, again, is another one of those that has established an excellent reputation. They used them in the Hemis.
Right.
Yeah, it has established, and your question, Gina, it all goes back to your original question. When we're asking these guys these questions about their cars, what we're asking is, from your knowledge and your experience and your skill, what did you decide on? It's not just, it would be fun to put a 9-inch Ford in, it's in there for a reason, or put a Dana in or something like that.
If they blew the rear end, that means they chose wrong?
Exactly correct. Or if it didn't, or if the car didn't perform well, they chose wrong. And that's what we're trying to do, is always trying to make things better. But in any event, those rear ends you're talking about for funny cars and everything, literally all of the pieces are going to be handmade. You're not going to use any factory components in there.
That's what I was getting at. Was it like they were specially built?
Yes, and that has changed over the years. At one time, they would use the heaviest, strongest, like an Olds rear end. Back in the late 50s for dragsters, they'd use an Olds rear end that was narrowed all the way to here, and they would just shorten the axles and respline them. They make much too much power for that now. They hand build most of the components and all that, and it's still a problem. It's a problem to put that much power through those big sticky tires and not have things break when you dump the clutch. It's a problem. Now, I want to real quick, now we've seen what a 9-inch Ford rear end looks like, and we've seen a 12-bolt, and we've seen a 10-bolt, and we've looked at the differentials. Now I want to show you another way to do it, and if you girls would step down around behind here, right around behind here. Now we are looking at a rear end here. Now, Gina, can you tell me where the differential is?
Where it is?
Point at it.
I would imagine probably like right here.
Okay, you're exactly correct. But do you see anything different here than what you're looking at over there?
Yeah, it's smaller and it looks different.
Okay, what's different about it is this is an independent suspension rear end. It means that, now if you'll notice, if you look...
That tells me a lot, Bill. You know, I really know what that means.
Okay, I'm going to explain what it means.
Nice term,
Wait
but-
a minute, I'm going to explain what it means. When these are underneath the rear of a rear drive car, this is not an independent, this is, you could call this a beam axle, although that's more often referred to in the front. But if you hit a bump with this wheel over here, obviously it affects that wheel because they're all on the same axle housing. Is that understandable? Okay. Wait a minute, Gina, you don't have a mic.
This bar here that goes around, is that what makes it independent?
Nope, that has nothing to do with it. That's just part of the chassis, and it's the way they happen to mount it on this one.
Then
What makes independent axles?
Well, you had independent axles in effect on the other one. What makes it different?
Boy, I don't.
Okay, I can see Elizabeth wants to tell us. Elizabeth, explain it to these girls.
I don't know. All I could see it's skinnier on the end, you know, like.
Okay, here's the way it works. Whereas this unit, and this has a lot to do with sprung and unsprung weight and all that, there are reasons for that. This unit, the differential, the axles, everything is connected together. You hit a bump with that wheel, it affects the other wheel, plus the fact this is a tremendous amount of unsprung weight. These components are heavy and they don't sit on springs. Wait a minute, Chris.
Are there two pinions inside that rear end?
No.
Because it would look like it might be because it...
Let me explain it. What happens here is this part of the unit, this differential section on an independent rear end, actually gets bolted to the chassis. It's part of the sprung chassis. It moves up and down with the chassis. It doesn't move up and down with the rear end. Obviously, though, if we look here, we can see that the wheels are out there just like they are on this thing here. So what happens is we have a sort of a universal joint. It's actually called a CV joint, right? Now, you know what CV joints are, right? You probably deliver them all the time?
Yeah, I do.
Okay, this is a CV. CV means constant velocity. This is a constant velocity joint. This is a constant velocity joint. And what happens here is this wheel can hit a bump, and it doesn't affect this wheel at all, because this is what I say a CV joint means it will move around like that and still transmit power. So will that one. So this wheel hits a bump. It doesn't affect this one. Now, there is some significant handling advantage to having independent rear suspension like this, as far as being able to go around corners faster. But probably more important, this one is Paul, tell me, you pulled this apart, Mercedes?
Yeah, this is out of a 74 240D Mercedes.
Okay, Mercedes is often accused of over-engineering their cars. I don't agree. I don't think there's any such thing as over-engineering if people have enough money to pay for it. Perhaps the most important thing this gives you is a more favorable sprung to unsprung weight ratio, and that's another show. I don't want to go into it too deeply. I just want to touch on it. One of the things that determines how well a car, there's an old myth that a heavier car is going to ride better and handle better on the highway. It's only sort of true. It's true, but it's only sort of true. The reason is not because it's heavy. It's because it has a terrific sprung to unsprung weight ratio. In other words, the lighter, yes, Christine? Go ahead.
I know that is a different show, but would you at least explain what that means?
Yes, I'm going to. Think for a minute. What is the... wait, what?
I think the camera wants another tape.
Okay, what do you want to tell our audience, Chris?
Don't go away. We'll be right back.
As fascinating as sprung to unsprung weight ratios probably are, we're out of time for this week.
Next week, we will conclude our look at rear ends, including independent designs.
We will also explain stagger, including what it is, what it looks like, and what it does.
We're also going to look at Jim Watson Sr.'s mint condition original 1931 Chevrolet two-door sedan.
And we're going to see what happens to cars when it's time to recycle them.
Until next week, for Bill Wildt, thanks for watching.
Motorsports Unlimited is produced by Bill Wildt, president of the Motorsport Advancement Crusade.
This program made possible in part by support from Muffler King, located on Larkin near Jefferson and Joliet.
The stars of this edition of Motorsports Unlimited were Gina Lisa, Elizabeth Rizzo, Kimberly Blackford, Marche Harmon, Chris Schutz, and Ann Fuller. Our fine production team was Paul Marchese, John Platania, Mike Sabatino, Chuck Hitzenthaler, Matt Matthias, and Bill Moore.
We would like to thank Star International Talent for helping us find some of our lovely ladies of motorsport.
The Motorsport Advancement Crusade is a nonprofit organization dedicated to the preservation and enhancement of motorsport. We are entirely funded by voluntary contribution. For more information, you can write Motorsport, or you can write the whole thing if you'd like, Motorsport Advancement Crusade, but mail us to us just fine, addressed Motorsport, P.O. Box 66242, Chicago, Illinois 60666, or just call it 1-312-478-4224. We enjoy hearing from our audience, and we encourage you to call or write.
This program made possible in part by support from Auto Magic Body Shop located in Franklin Park.
So that's it, another edition of Motorsports Unlimited and the lovely ladies of motorsports. And be with us next week because we'll have something real exciting. Bill Wildt's going to have the lovely ladies, and just about anything can happen right here on Motorsports Unlimited. Every week at this time, we bring you the best in motorsports. So, be seeing ya. Bye-bye. And keep on rocking.